5 reasons the 80s were totally bogus, totally lame compared to today, dude. I'm Chris Corsello. You're watching The Daily Dose. Previously on The Daily Dose, I made a video called 5 Reasons the 80s Were More Awesome Than Today. While most people in the comments agreed with me, a few said that we're always glamorizing the past and making it sound better than it really was. Well, that's the nature of nostalgia. Of course, that's the case. You know, when you reminisce, you tend to remember the good things, at least those of us who look at the glass as half full, remember the good things. Now, just to be fair, let's go 5 reasons why the 80s were lame. I'm going to skip things like, oh, there was no internet. Obviously, things that weren't invented is an obvious reason why the future would be better than. So let's just leave those out of it, although some of those apply in some ways anyway. So let's get to it. Reason number 1, TV. Let's be honest, TV pretty well sucked in the 80s. One notable exception, of course, I make that claim and then I start with an exception. One notable exception would be the show Cheers. That's a good show. Even now when I watch it, it's on Hulu, by the way. It's a good show. But the only other shows in the 80s that really stood out were shows that really started in the 70s that carried over into the 80s. Things like Mork and Mindy or MASH. Those were good shows, but they're really 70s shows that kept going, or 80s enough. They're 70s shows that went into the 80s. Now, I was young in the 80s, so I didn't mind watching garbage sitcom because there weren't a whole lot of choices. But I'm going to give you a couple examples, and maybe they're shows you've never heard of, and if not, it's for good reason, and you should spare yourself. Growing Pains, starring a guy named Kirk Cameron. If you've never heard of him, count yourself as lucky. The show, although mildly entertaining at the time, extremely unoffensive. That was the problem with sitcoms in the 80s, is they went out of their way to be what we would now call politically correct and unoffensive and wholesome and very vanilla. Another example of that was Silver Spoons, starring Ricky Schroeder. While I enjoyed this show as a kid because he had arcade games in his house and it was about this kid who got adopted, who didn't know, well, he didn't get adopted. He discovered that his estranged father was wealthy and moved in with him, and he went from being this kid in a boarding school to being a super rich, kind of Richie Rich kind of kid. It's really terrible. If you watch it today, it's not good. The jokes are terrible. Just like I said about Growing Pains. Very vanilla, very just unoffensive, out of its way to be unoffensive. Terrible show. One show that might be, I still wouldn't say it was great, but it was the cream of the crap, was called Family Ties. And it starred Michael J. Fox. That show was actually pretty good for the 80s. Not pretty good by today's standards, or even by the standards of the 70s, but for the 80s, it was all right. I'm sure people will have other things to say. I didn't watch Dallas or Dynasty or any of that kind of nighttime serialized soap opera kind of crap. Reason number 2. Number 2 actually relates to TV as well. Most of us had only 24 channels. And that was only if you had cable. Now remember, it was channels 2 through 13. So that's 12 channels times 2, that's 24. We had a little A-B switch. Turn your TV, click, 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 click. You know, I mean, there were starting to be some digital tuners, but mostly it was 2 through 13. And some of those channels were throwaways. There was always like a community bulletin board that was just, that said like what was happening. Like, oh, the SPCA is having a meeting on Thursday night at 7 over at the community center. Stuff that you're not really going to sit and watch. So, and then there were at least 2 channels, HBO and Showtime, that unless you paid extra, just like now, weren't available. Although they didn't do as much new content as they do today. It was mostly your chance to see movies at home after, you know, several months of being out of the theater. So not the really good content that they produce today. The other thing about that is really you only had a few networks creating original content, mostly ABC, CBS, and NBC. also PBS, if you're into that sort of thing, and what they used to call Superstation WTBS, Turner Broadcasting, which is just now known as TBS. And there were a few cable channels. There was MTV, for example. Nickelodeon got its start in the 80s, although it was very different. So the choices on TV were very limited, and of course we didn't have the internet, so there was a lot of times where you couldn't find anything on TV to watch, which maybe isn't a bad thing, because we shouldn't all sit around watching TV, 24 channels of garbage. Oh, CNN launched back then, and so did ESPN. So there were a few. Reason number 3. I'm going to go with fashion. Okay, now I realize a lot of fashion from the 80s is back. It's that retro thing. It's cool. Everybody's wearing Vans and Converse these days. But let me tell you, when I was in middle school and high school, only the cool kids, like myself, of course, wore Vans and Converse. The trendy kids were wearing these awful shoes called topsiders. I mean, topsiders were hideous. They were ugly. They were embarrassing. And only us skaters were wearing Vans and sometimes what they called burnouts. Converse, those were certain segment of the school. Although when I was playing basketball, we still wore Nikes. So there's that. Other thing I'll say is swatches. I don't think I've seen the Swatch watch come back. Swatches were supposed to be these trendy, cool watches. We didn't have cell phones, so if you wanted to tell time, you needed a watch. Swatches had these Art Deco designs, if you will. They made them in bright neon colors, but most of them were hideous. They were really bad. So just keep in mind when you're talking about 80s fashion, nostalgia, like I said at the beginning, kind of takes the good stuff and stuff that stood the test of time, because there was a lot of stuff that didn't come back and isn't ever coming back and should have never been a thing in the first place. Now, the more serious ones. Number 4, global thermonuclear war. So, global thermonuclear war. This generation has climate change. You're constantly being told that the Earth's going to be uninhabitable and that you might not make it to old age. And while that is scary and that may be a very real threat if we don't take action, our generation was constantly reminded that nuclear war was imminent. That the Russians at any time were going to send ICBMs, that's intercontinental ballistic missiles, our way, and that we would have 6 minutes to live. So while climate change might be terrifying, that you might not make it to your old age, we were constantly being told, oh, you're going to suddenly find out that in 6 minutes a global thermonuclear weapon is going to detonate and you and everyone you know are going to be wiped out. This was something that was really scary. If you want to see a film from the 80s that kind of captured the essence of this, Wargames with Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy. It also is a good capture of kind of where technology was in the 80s. Now, the voice synthesis was actually fake. Voice synthesis wasn't actually that good on home computers back then, but it made for a good film. And even though it's not completely technically a good historical record, it's a fun movie, and it'll let you get a glimpse into people's attitudes toward nuclear war and the feeling our generation had about that threat, that anytime life as we know it could be done. I'll put the link in the description. Number 5, AIDS and HIV. Now, I realize this still exists today, but it was a very new thing in the 80s. People were very misinformed about it, a lot of fear, and of course there was no treatment. Now, we can't cure it yet, but there are treatments. People can live much fuller lives than they did. Back then, there was very little known about it. It was believed that it spread much more rapidly than it turned out to actually spread. They were expecting large swaths of the population to have it. And it really made a lot of young people very fearful of sex. And, better be careful who you sleep with. You might get AIDS and die. So AIDS was, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be something that people should be careful about today, but it was a much bigger unknown. It was a much bigger threat, a much bigger scare. And oftentimes people who contracted it died pretty quickly. Now, Eazy-E was in the early 90s, but good example. You know, he didn't live very long. So those are my 5 reasons the 80s were totally bogus and lame, dude, compared to today. Another one I'm going to throw in there, the honorable mention, is the word dude. As far as I know, the word dude rose in the 80s. In fact, by the late 80s, we were making fun of people who said dude, like the doggy dude on the floor. And there's a song by a band that never really made it big named Scatterbrain called Don't Call Me Dude. Song about this guy who goes crazy when you call him dude. I'll put the link in the description. Don't call me dude. Anyway, next time we will get back, not the very next episode, but next time we do an episode about the 80s, we will be back to the things that made the 80s awesome. So, hit that subscribe button, check out some of my other videos, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.